We're starting with the afternoon session. In this case, it's Emily Teeter, Research Associate from the Field Museum in Chicago. Preliminary plans for the new African and Egyptian galleries at the Field Museum, Chicago. All yours.
Nice to be here. Always nice to be here for CPEG. And I'm glad to represent a museum which I don't think has been represented at CPEG, maybe perhaps ever. And that is the Field Museum in Chicago, Field Museum of Natural History. And as you can see from the exterior image, it's one of those mega museums. Very old museum. It was founded in 1894 in Chicago, one of the early institutions. Just like Tom Hardwick was talking about, this is a natural history museum, and so it, to some extent, by default, ended up with ethnographic collections, including Egypt. The Egyptian collection numbers about 3,200 objects, depending on how you're counting them, because there are a great number also of lithics and also a very good collection of Coptic textiles, which are not always included in that 3,200. Most of the collection was purchased by the first president of the museum, Edward Ayer. He was primarily a collector of American Indian ethnographic material and books. He was on a Mediterranean cruise in 1894, and he stopped in Cairo, and he was entranced because he saw the sales offices near Shepherd's Hotel. And in his memoir, he recounts, he said to his wife, "I'm going to stay right here for a month or 6 weeks and make a collection for the Field Museum." He also admitted to being ignorant about Egypt, and so he relied upon Emile Bruch at the Giza Museum, imploring him to, quote, "help me understand the situation here so I can make as few mistakes as possible in securing articles here in Egypt for our collection." On this first trip, he purchased over 700 objects. In one of his letters to the then director of the Field Museum, he wrote, "I've purchased about 20 mummies, all the mummy shoes, whatever those are, 25 canopic jars, a lot of wooden and stone images, and the best lot of Greek and Roman bronzes that I believe ever left Egypt." He returned to Egypt and continued his purchasing in 1896 and 1898. He was, quote, "motivated by educational value of artifacts and ethnographic material." His collecting seemed to be largely unfocused. He just loved collecting things. And so he was collecting a broad representation of material from ancient Egypt. Like the other two institutions in Chicago, if you remember, Chicago is unusual in that we have 3 Egyptian collections, one at the University of Chicago, one at the Art Institute, and one at the Field Museum. All 3 institutions, including the Field Museum, then subscribe to the EEF. And so there is some excavated provenance material, but most of it is completely unprovenanced and has really no history to it, although I'm sure that great project for people to start tracing some of this material that Ayer bought. The 3 collections in Chicago created sort of a problem for Ayer. He wrote to James Henry Breasted, who of course was at the Oriental Institute and starting their collection. In 1902, he wrote to Breasted, "As it now stands, there are 3 Egyptian collections in Chicago. While there's certainly no use but for one, it's perfectly ridiculous. I think as stated above that after the Field Museum was started, it was a great mistake for the university to make any attempt in that direction. I should be very glad to become a permanent subscriber to the EEF for 20% of the money necessary to keep our position in the Petrie or any other exploration funds in Egypt, provided the collections should be consolidated where they should be, in the Field Columbian Museum." Obviously, Breasted didn't go for that in any particular way. And Breasted wrote him back a letter quoting, Berlin has 3 collections and these other great European cities with multiple collections to make Ayer get off his case. Their relationship was patched up because Breasted then later advised Ayer on later purchases. And the collection has some very, very fine material, including the very famous, one of the famous statues of Senmut, a Sekhmet, perhaps not the best example of a Sekhmet, but a very interesting history. This used to stand in the garden of the Luxor Hotel. And the accession records are hilarious because Ayer bought it for 5 Egyptian pounds, us remembering that a pound was a lot of money back then, but the value was so low that they had to actually, to enhance the value of it for customs to accept it for export. They said, you didn't buy this for 5 pounds. But we also have a lot of reliefs from Bach and Renouf, a very large collection. So as you can see, there's a lot of this has potential for what's coming up. And some very fine examples of sculpture. Here, a very nice 18th, probably late 18th dynasty head. And here, as you can see, it's being used in an exhibit of personal adornment and makeup, where, in fact, because of the damage to the face, you could do a lot of interesting things with this particular piece. So the collection is presently exhibited on 2 levels in galleries, primarily redesigned in 1981 by Don Whitcomb of the Oriental Institute. This was following on the heels of the Treasures of Tutankhamun show in 1977, which at the Field Museum, like many American museums, reminded the directorship, the leadership, that Egypt had an enormous popular following and that they should capitalize on their collections. So it was reinstalled in 1981, and then this is the 1981 configuration, more heavily archaeological because of the background of Don Whitcomb. And then in 1987, the present exhibition was done called Inside Ancient Egypt, divided into zones. At the bottom of this image is the Mastaba of Unas Ankh, which is actually on an upper level. So the Mastaba chapel is on an upper level, and then you go down this kind of odd stairway down into the tomb, the burial chamber, which then leads to the rest of the galleries, which are shown at the top of this plan. It is a somewhat schizophrenic sort of installation. It has a lot of different moods. Downstairs, this is the Unas Ankh chapel. Downstairs, the first thing you encounter are a number of different tomb groups with disparate materials from generally the same chronological period to give the visitor an idea of the types of materials from tombs of that particular period. And as you can see, the museum does have some very, very fine pieces here from 13th dynasty, third intermediate period. So again, tremendous potential of what could be done with this collection. Then there are some odd things that were done. There's one section which is sort of loculi with later period mummies in them, which makes them impossible to see, and an even odder sort of presentation of the animal mummies. Americans will recognize Uncle Milty's ant farm, which is what this looks like to me. So, but again, the material is there, and it's far too long to put off reinstalling this collection in a way that will really take advantage of the material. Of course, one of the stars of the show is the Dashur boat, the Sen Wozeret boat. As you know, there's one at Carnegie in Pittsburgh, and the other one is in Chicago. As part of this reinstallation, there's going to be a complete reconservation of the boat. It will be disassembled. Each of the planks, it will be recorded from photogrammetry. Each plank will be CT'd, so there'll be a tremendous amount of research being done on this boat. And Carnegie and Chicago are going to be working together on this, which will be really very good, so we know more about the relationship of these boats. The other parts of the present installation, a Bastet shrine, which is kind of cute, and then the thing that I find is very sort of schizophrenic is the so-called marketplace, which makes up the middle part of the present galleries. And these are vignettes taken from Neant Khnum and Khnum Hotep. And this is obviously a way for hands-on with kids. And so that is one of my criticisms of this. There's a hands-on section right in the middle of areas which are much more sophisticated. So we're trying to figure out what to do with this. And then there are the usual number of thematic cases, again, with very good material that could be rearranged. bronzes, lots of bronzes. And then a very curious case that says basically, this is our prettiest stuff. Again, very, very fine pieces that could be used to great advantage. And then a thing that people love is this miniature diorama. The figures are about 2 inches tall, and it is a very well done diorama, about 4 different sections of it showing an embalmer's workshop. It's really great. So got to figure out how that can be reinstalled and used. But what has a lot more potential is a second Old Kingdom mastaba chapel, this of Netzer User, which is presently inaccessible. It was never moved from the original installation, and there is money in this new installation to bring this out and exhibit it along with the Unis Ankh. So we're one of the few museums in North America that has 2 Old Kingdom chapels. Now in 2024, following a very generous private gift, the museum has started a process of redesigning the Egyptian galleries as part of their new Africa Hall, Africa and Egypt. So this is one of these plans to show everything from the African continent. And of course, everybody in this room understands there are certain challenges with that, geographically, culturally, and chronologically. So we're still trying to figure out exactly how this can be done effectively. One problem is that the Egyptian collection is much larger than the rest of the South African, West, and East African. There's very little from the Maghreb. There's a large collection of Madagascar, which is interesting. So this has some real issues with how we present this. The director of the museum wants it presented as Africa is the birthplace of human culture and civilization. You know, we all come from Africa, and ultimately. And so this is what we're trying to figure out, how we do this, and in particular, making sure that Egypt is kept very, very much in the picture as Egypt is part of Africa and is part of this whole story. But it is difficult to mesh the ancient Egyptian collections, which have, as you know, so much more diversity in materials, in appearance. People are more familiar with it. Most of the other non-Egyptian African collections tend to be colonial collections, so they are 19th century, if you're lucky. A lot of it's 20th century, although there are some very good bronzes. They're not all going back, some of them are fine, from Southwest Africa. So there are about 2,500 objects from Nigeria, about 900 from the Yoruba cultures. So what to do? First of all, we want to avoid missteps, misrepresenting what these cultures are, misrepresenting definite links between these cultures, but perhaps representing Egypt as a continent of tremendous diversity and antiquity, and trying to do something. This, again, we haven't figured out what we're going to do, but the basic idea is it will be shown in the context of Africa. The director of the museum is very intent, though, on keeping a very specific Egyptian presence. He told me, I want to see a big Egyptian gallery. Fine, 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 fine. I want to see a lot of mummies and coffins. Great, we can do that too. Also, the administration of the museum is very aware that the Chicago Public Schools relies on the Field Museum for 5th and 6th grade curricula that deals specifically with Egypt. And so it would be a very bad idea, as was one point, one idea was to sort of mix the Egyptian material in with the non-Egyptian African material. And luckily that was discarded pretty quickly as being unworkable with the needs of the Chicago Public Schools. So what will happen is there will be a new gallery of 27,000 square feet, all on one level. It's approximately 2,500 square meters. So I want to show you what we've done so far. In early this year, a request for proposals went out to 11 of the very large design teams. and 4 of them were invited to Chicago to give presentations on what they thought should be done for the Field Museum. Speaking for me personally, this was a very interesting experience. I've done a lot of museum installations, but I've never worked with these mega companies. And it was a real eye-opener. So let me show you. With the RFP, with the request for proposals, they were told basically what the concept was and what they would do. And then they had 3 particular specific things to show. One was the boat, the Dashur boat. One was the Mastaba Chapel. And the third doesn't concern us here. It was a recreation of Great Zimbabwe, although there are no objects for Great Zimbabwe, but that doesn't seem to bother them. So this is a general idea of where the new galleries will be on the main floor of the Field Museum, which is a very, very large museum, as you can see. And so very different ideas about how Egypt would be incorporated in the rest of the African material or not. So very, very different ideas about that. Here's another one with Egypt being its own sort of bubble off to the side. Although the museum is favoring having a separate Egyptian gallery, but somehow having an orientation area perhaps where there's an integration of the ideas. There is a problem also, how do you keep this looking like Egypt is sort of the dog and the rest of Africa is the tail? Because Egypt is going to have a larger floor presence and people are more familiar with Egypt than they are with the rest of Africa. So again, how do you balance out this idea of presenting Africa when Egypt is going to be the most recognizable part of this installation? Here's another idea. So again, nothing has been decided, but it was very, very interesting looking at these different concepts of how these mega museum companies who deal with a lot of museums and a lot of interesting issues would do this. Another one where, for example, the Dashur boat is integrated within sections like transportation throughout Africa. And then going specifically to the presentation of the Senwasser boat, here's one idea where it would be visible from the front. The back of the case would be used for didactics and related material. Another idea, a walk around with sort of an immersive experience. These companies are very big on immersive experiences around the sides of it. Another one. So it was very, very interesting to see these different ideas of what they would do. Then for the mastaba of Netcher Usher, which is the one that's currently not on display, one idea shown here was to have the chapel, which, as you know, is an Old Kingdom chapel, so it's very restricted. So very few people can fit into it. The fire department has conniptions about this because of traffic in and out of it. So this one company, this is Applebaum, suggested leaving the mastaba intact and then doing a replica where you could move the walls apart, sort of like in Munich where they expanded, or we'd call it exploded, but you don't want to use that term, expanded the walls. So there was that idea. Another one which I thought was quite interesting was because there are 2 chapels, the one that is more constricted, you would move the walls apart slightly, but then you would leave the other one intact. So to give an idea, so the one that would be expanded actually has the better reliefs. So you have better viewing of those reliefs. The one where the reliefs are good, but they're not as good, would still be the quite constricted space. So I think that was kind of interesting. And this one was really interesting, to suspend it. Which is very odd. They would hang it from the ceiling, which I didn't quite get how that's going to make the viewing so much better. Tina, I love your expression. it's like so this just gives you an idea of some of the issues that we're dealing with. As I mentioned, nothing has been decided, very much in the conceptual stage. Team of people working on it. the ideal is, well, the target date is 2027, which might be a little bit hopeful. But that at least gives you an idea of what's going on at the Field Museum. And I'll keep you posted. Thank you.
Well, any questions? Thank you very much for such an interesting conference. The last image is quite surprising. This one, how is it going to be?
Frightening.
Frightening. But 2027, we'll be there.
Yeah.
So anybody,
Yeah,
any
good,
questions?
actually, a good time for CPEG to come back to the States is when this opens.
Well, wonderful. We have one down, 2027, Pennsylvania, Chicago.
So just to give you a feedback on the master bar issue, because as you know, in Berlin, I think it's the only place where there are 3 master bars, and they were all separated. So
Right.
they are all not in their kind of normal architectural place, and the audience actually doesn't understand at all that these are very small, tiny little old kingdom chapels, and the room experience is completely distorted if you take the walls apart. And therefore, I would highly recommend at least keep one together.
Yeah.
Because then the people would understand a cult chapel is not a huge entity normally. There are some, but the one in the museums are small. And if you present all of them, as it was the case, the decision was taken from the previous director.
Yes.
That they are all presented in a form where it's no longer authentic, and the audience really don't understand the context of these, and that they really should be moved together, the reliefs, and they just recognize it as reliefs, but they don't get the architecture of these. So if you have the opportunity,
Yeah.
because yesterday in Penn I can understand that there are the demand, and also in Germany the fire department runs crazy if you make such a proposal. But if you have the opportunity, as you have, with 2 master bars, keep one together, if it's possible.
I'm glad you mentioned that, and I will pass that along. I was at this conference and we had this comment. Because I remember in Berlin, I mean, there was an attempt by putting the outline on the floor, but people don't get it. People don't get it.
There's even a railing to keep the people away from because there's not a glass cover, but you have just a kind of
A rail, yeah.
This makes it strange. So you really lose the authentic architecture, and the understanding is really.
Yeah, because as we know, the architecture and the confined space is part of that whole story. You know, the use of these spaces, they're designed for that particular use. So, any other comments I can pass along to the powers that be? Yes.
Sorry, may I comment something just briefly? Excuse me. What you mentioned, Gabi, that's true, and also Emily, here in the museum, in the area of the Iberian culture, we have a very special structure which is called Pozomoro, and in the floor, it has been outlined what we think the structure might have been, and it's an area that we call temenos. It's like the area that was sacred next to that structure, and people don't understand what that is. In fact, they don't step on that area because they feel that it's like a kind of a barrier, and no, perhaps it wasn't well explained, but that line on the floor means that all that area was sacred. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that's going to be of any help, but yes, we have it here, and I don't think visitors really understand the meaning of that. Sorry.
That's okay. Hello, Emily. Thank you so much for this interesting presentation and the interesting museum as well. So I just have a question about the Hanged Chapel. I would like to, yes, I would like to know the approach.
It's not going to happen. Sorry.
Actually, for years, museums are always keen to display, especially the ancient Egyptian artifacts, in its original possession. So I just would like to know what was the approach behind hanging the chapel.
I have no idea. This was a design firm that was asked to present concepts. And they even included at least sketchy or preliminary engineering drawings to show us how this could be done. But basically, we all kind of passed over this one. It's like, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, but no thank you. But it is like, what would be the advantage of this? You can't, it makes the release even harder to see because you're underneath it. And who wants to walk under tons and tons of stone?
Just in case.
Yeah, just in case. Yeah. So I think I can guarantee this is not going to happen.
Hopefully, yes, hopefully.
Yeah. Jen, you had a...
I'd be curious to know who the designer was. You have to say it because Joe just reminded me.
Studio Joseph.
Oh, that wasn't one we had because Joe reminded me that when we were at this point with our design, there was something that we all called Spaceship Kapura that one of the design companies had proposed, which again was sort of an elevated...
With an illuminated ramp that went up.
to outer space, so...
Yeah. Yeah, can you tell me which company that was? Do you remember?
It wasn't the one...
It wasn't
you
Studio
just-
Joseph?
No,
Okay.
no, I don't remember the name, but...
Okay.
Because you presented the starting point of the museum, and as a natural history museum, I can understand that they come back to Africa, to the idea of Africa. But are you not afraid? We all have seen what happened last year in Leiden with the Africa emphasis and the exhibition the colleagues in Leiden did, and what was the reaction of
Sure.
the Egyptian ministry, who kind of freaked out, and the Egyptian delegation was forbidden to enter the museum, which was a big pity.
Just wait till you see what's going to happen at the Met in November.
Exactly, the Met will be banned as well, but they're already banned.
I think we have better senses than that, because geography is one thing, culture is another. And a thing that I am very intent on is making sure that ancient Egypt is related to modern Egypt. It's not done enough. In the United States, there's this big thing about making Africa seem like a monolithic culture, because Americans think differently about Africa than the rest of the world does. But it's very important that Egypt be related to Egypt. I mean, because even that is such an interesting issue. And so we're going to make very sure. We had a planning meeting last week, and it's talking about the community, people, the stakeholders, and who's going to, blah, 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 blah. And they kept on talking about African-American community. And I said, pardon me, where are the Egyptians and Arabs in this? They need a seat at this table. Because I think, I don't think we would go down that road at all. But you are aware in November, the Met is opening a show which is going to be probably about as inflammatory as Kemet was. And that is presented, of course, by the contemporary art department, who just doesn't seem to care. Thank you.